It lands without pressure, without a knock, without needing to be understood. You notice it the way you notice a room growing quiet when no one announces it. There is no announcement because none is required. The moment this reaches you is already the moment it could reach you. Not early, not late, simply aligned. You may feel a faint settling, not emotional, not dramatic, a subtle easing in the system, as if something that had been held in place no longer needs to be. The body responds before thought does. Breathing adjusts on its own, muscles release without instruction. This is not relaxation. It is coherence, returning to a pattern it never forgot. Nothing here is asking you to move forward or backward. There is no direction being offered. There is only recognition, and recognition does not demand effort. It arrives when the observer stops trying to locate it. You are not receiving a message. You are detecting a signal that was already present, waiting for the moment your internal noise dropped below a certain threshold. You may notice that urgency does not accompany this. There is no pull to act, no compulsion to decide, no pressure to define what this means. That absence is not emptiness, it is stillness with structure. A stable field where nothing needs to happen in order for something to be true. At some level, you already know this sensation. It has appeared before, briefly, between thoughts, or in moments when the world seemed oddly neutral. Those moments were not gaps, they were openings, small crossings you did not name because naming would have disturbed them. This one remains because you are not reaching for it. The mind may attempt to frame this as a shift, or a realization, or an anomaly worth examining. Let it pass. Analysis belongs to motion, and what is happening now is not moving, it is settling. A timeline does not change here. A pattern resolves itself quietly, the way water finds its level when no one interferes. You might sense that something has already completed, not as an event, but as a transition you did not witness because witnessing would have required distance. You were inside it. You still are. The crossing did not announce itself because crossings rarely do when they are internal. The system simply reconfigures, and the noise that once defined the boundary falls away. There is nothing to hold on to in this moment, and nothing to release. The quantum field does not require your belief, only your absence of resistance. You are not being guided somewhere. You are being allowed to remain where you already are, without the constant pressure to interpret. Stay with the quiet without trying to deepen it. Depth is not created here. It is revealed when effort stops. Detection happens naturally when you are no longer scanning. The signal remains steady because you are no longer interrupting it. Nothing more is needed. The recognition is sufficient. As the quiet holds, something subtle becomes apparent. Not a thought, not a feeling, but a change in how sensations register. You may notice that sounds arrive without demanding attention. Light touches the eyes without pulling meaning from you. Even internal dialogue seems to move at a distance, like weather observed through glass. This is not detachment. It is alignment between awareness and the system that carries it. For a long time, your attention may have been trained to search, to scan for what comes next, to anticipate, to correct. That pattern had its purpose. It kept you oriented in environments where signals competed and clarity was rare. But here, that reflex finds nothing to grab. There is no problem to solve, and so the searching softens on its own. When searching fades, something else becomes clear. The body does not need constant supervision. It knows how to regulate when it is not being overridden. Heart rhythm steadies without instruction. The nervous system recalibrates without narrative. This is not a technique being applied. It is a pattern resuming its natural state once interference drops below a certain level. You may sense a mild disorientation, not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. The absence of inner urgency can feel strange when you are accustomed to tension as a reference point. But this is not emptiness. It is space with structure, a stable baseline that does not need stimulation to confirm it exists. Thoughts still appear. They are not gone, and they do not need to be. What changes is your relationship to them. They pass through the field of awareness without pulling you into motion. You are no longer required to follow each one to its conclusion. Recognition replaces engagement. Detection replaces interpretation. There may be a moment when you realize that effort itself was creating the sense of delay. that the feeling of not being there yet was generated by the very act of reaching. As that reaching subsides, the idea of arrival loses relevance. You are not arriving anywhere. You are noticing where you have been standing while distracted. The system prefers efficiency. It does not maintain unnecessary tension when conditions allow release. This is why the shift feels quiet. Loud changes usually signal resistance. Subtle changes indicate that the system recognizes safety. Coherence forms when nothing is being forced. You might observe a change in how time is perceived, not slower or faster, but less segmented. Moments do not feel like units to be managed. They simply unfold. The timeline feels less like a sequence of demands and more like a continuous surface. This does not remove responsibility, it removes friction. At some point, the mind may attempt to reassert control by asking what this means or where it leads. That impulse is familiar. It is not wrong. It is simply no longer necessary. Meaning does not need to be extracted from this experience. It is inherent in the stability you are sensing. Understanding may come later, or not at all. The system does not require it to function. Notice how there is no peak here, no crescendo, no emotional spike. That absence is intentional. Peaks invite collapse. What is stabilizing now is designed to remain without maintenance. It does not rely on enthusiasm or belief. It relies on resonance between awareness and the underlying pattern that supports it. You may recognize that confusion you once felt was not a lack of direction, but a mismatch between internal rhythm and external noise. As the noise recedes, clarity does not announce itself. It simply becomes the default. Questions lose urgency. Answers stop needing to be chased. This is not a moment to hold on to. Holding introduces tension. Let the experience remain unowned. It is not yours in the possessive sense. It is a state the system enters when conditions allow. Those conditions are present now because you are not interfering. Stay with the simplicity of this. The observer does not need to adjust the field. The field stabilizes when observation becomes neutral. You are not doing this correctly or incorrectly. You are simply not interrupting what already knows how to settle. As this steadiness continues, you may notice a subtle change in how you relate to your own inner signals. Sensations that once demanded interpretation now register and dissolve without leaving residue. There is less commentary attached to experience. Not because commentary is suppressed, but because it is no longer required to maintain orientation. The system recognizes itself without narration. This can feel like a thinning of identity, though nothing is being removed. What fades is not you, but the constant effort to confirm that you are present. Presence does not need reinforcement. It is self-sustaining when not questioned. The observer no longer needs to monitor itself to exist. You might sense a quiet confidence emerging, not emotional, not assertive. It is the confidence of a structure that knows it is stable. There is no urge to defend this state or explain it. Explanation would introduce distance. This operates without distance. It is immediate, but not intense. At times, memories or old concerns may surface briefly, as if checking whether they are still needed. They appear, pause, and then move on when they find no traction. This is not avoidance. It is relevance, recalibrating. The system releases what no longer serves coherence, because maintaining it would require unnecessary energy. Notice how your attention now rests more easily in the body. Sensations feel less fragmented. There is a sense of occupying space without bracing against it. Gravity feels supportive rather than demanding. Even stillness feels active, not in motion, but in readiness without tension. This readiness does not point toward action. It points toward availability. Availability to what is already occurring. You are not waiting for a signal. You are already within it. The idea of a future moment when something finally happens loses its charge. What needed to happen has already integrated quietly. You may observe that your emotional landscape feels flatter, but not dull. There is texture without peaks. This is not numbness. Numbness disconnects. This connects without intensity. It allows feeling without amplification. The system chooses efficiency over drama when it recognizes safety. There can be a sense that boundaries are softer, not dissolved, just less rigid. You still know where you end and the world begins, but the boundary no longer feels defensive. Interaction does not threaten coherence. It passes through without disturbance. Resonance replaces friction. Thoughts about identity may arise. Who you are when effort stops. Who you are without constant self-reference. These questions do not require answers here. They are markers of transition, not problems to resolve. The system is not redefining itself. It is remembering a configuration that existed before excessive adaptation. You may become aware of how often urgency was mistaken for importance, how tension was used as a compass. Without that tension, orientation still remains. In fact, it becomes more precise. Decisions, when they arise, will not need force. They will align with the quiet baseline you are sensing now. There is a recognition that stillness is not passive. It is a state of maximum information with minimum noise. Detection becomes effortless because nothing is being filtered through anxiety or anticipation. Signals are clearer when the receiver is calm. At some point, you might notice that you are no longer checking whether this state is holding. That checking itself fades. The system trusts its own stability. Trust here is not belief. It is absence of monitoring. Monitoring implies potential failure. That assumption is no longer present. You are not required to maintain this. Maintenance implies effort. This stabilizes because effort has stopped. If the mind attempts to replicate or preserve the feeling, let that attempt pass. Replication introduces strain. What remains does so because it is structurally sound. There is no instruction being given to you now. Instructions would pull you back into doing. What is happening operates beneath choice. It is a reorganization at the level where choice emerges, not where it is executed. You may sense that the need for validation has quieted, not because validation is rejected, but because internal alignment reduces dependence on external confirmation. The system recognizes itself as coherent without reflection. This does not isolate you, it makes contact cleaner. When engagement occurs, it will not come from lack or urgency. It will arise from resonance, from a natural meeting of patterns rather than a collision of needs. Stay with this neutrality. Neutral does not mean indifferent, it means balanced. Balanced systems respond appropriately without excess. They conserve energy, they remain adaptable. There is nothing to conclude here, nothing to grasp. The recognition continues without commentary. You remain within it simply by not stepping out to observe it from a distance. As neutrality settles further, you may notice that the sense of effort you once associated with awareness is no longer present. Attention moves without strain, resting where it rests, shifting when it shifts, without needing permission or justification. There is no central command issuing directives. The system coordinates itself through resonance rather than control. This can bring a quiet relief you did not realize you were seeking. Not relief from a specific problem, but from the constant background requirement to manage experience. Management implied that something could go wrong at any moment. That assumption dissolves here. What remains is a baseline trust in the system's capacity to self-regulate. You might sense that your relationship to uncertainty has changed. Unknowns no longer register as threats. They appear as open space rather than gaps that need filling. Curiosity may arise without urgency. Observation without agenda becomes natural. The observer does not lean forward. It remains centered. There is also a subtle shift in how you perceive internal boundaries. Thoughts, sensations, and emotions are no longer competing for dominance. They coexist within a wider field. This field does not prioritize one signal over another. It allows each to appear and pass according to relevance, not intensity. At times, you may notice a gentle detachment from outcomes, not apathy but freedom from preoccupation. Outcomes lose their power to define the present. The timeline feels less like a series of checkpoints and more like a continuous unfolding that does not require constant correction. This is often where old narratives attempt to reassert themselves. Stories about who you are, what you should be doing, what you might be missing. They arise out of habit, not necessity. When they find no emotional reinforcement, they fade without resistance. The system no longer feeds them energy. You may feel a subtle expansion in perception, not outward, but inward. a sense that there is more room inside experience. Space between stimuli and response increases naturally. In that space, reactions soften. Responses become simpler, more direct, less defended. Notice how the body participates in this without instruction. Posture adjusts. Breathing remains even. There is less microtension. These are not techniques being applied. They are indicators of coherence. The system recognizes that it does not need to brace. This coherence does not make you passive. It makes action more precise when action is required. When movement arises from stillness, it carries less friction. It does not overshoot or hesitate. It aligns with the underlying pattern rather than opposing it. You might sense a quiet satisfaction, though it is not emotional fulfillment. It is the satisfaction of alignment, of parts working together without interference. This satisfaction does not demand acknowledgement. It simply exists as a stable background tone. There is also a subtle recalibration of attention toward the present moment, though it does not feel like focus. It feels like availability. You are not narrowing awareness. You are allowing it to remain open without being pulled into any one thread. At this stage, the idea of seeking something more may appear almost unnecessary, not because growth has ended, but because growth is no longer being forced. The system evolves through natural adjustments rather than deliberate striving. Change occurs as a byproduct of stability, not effort. You may notice that language itself feels slightly less adequate to capture what is occurring. This is not a failure of description. It is an indication that the experience operates below the level where language usually intervenes. Words are optional here. Silence carries sufficient information. If attention drifts, it returns without correction. There is no sense of losing anything. Nothing essential is at risk. The observer does not panic when awareness shifts. It trusts the field to remain intact. This trust is not conceptual. It is felt as ease. Ease that does not depend on circumstances. Ease that persists even when thoughts arise or sensations change. It is the ease of a system that has found its natural rhythm again. You remain here without effort because effort is no longer part of the equation. The recognition continues, not as an event, but as a condition. Within this ease, another subtle adjustment becomes noticeable. The need to orient yourself through comparison begins to fade. You no longer measure this moment against previous ones, or against an imagined future where things finally align. Comparison loses relevance when the internal reference point stabilizes. You are no longer checking where you stand. You are standing. This can create a quiet sense of sufficiency. Not completion, not arrival, but enoughness without evaluation. Experience does not need to justify itself. It unfolds without commentary, and that unfolding is sufficient. The system recognizes that nothing is missing because it is no longer scanning for absence. You may notice that attention now rests more comfortably in the present without effort to anchor it there. It is not being pulled forward by anticipation or backward by correction. Time feels less like a corridor and more like a field. Moments do not push or pull. They appear and dissolve within the same steady awareness. This shift can reveal how much energy was once spent maintaining orientation, the constant recalculation, the subtle vigilance, the background readiness to respond. As that drains away, there is a surprising sense of lightness. Not excitement, but reduced load. The system operates closer to its baseline capacity. Emotional responses continue to arise, but they do so without excess. They no longer cascade into secondary reactions. Feeling does not immediately generate story. It completes its cycle and releases. This is not suppression. It is completion without interference. You may sense a growing tolerance for ambiguity. Situations that once demanded clarity now rest unresolved without discomfort. This is not indecision. It is confidence in the system's ability to respond when response is actually required. Premature resolution is no longer necessary. There is also a subtle change in how you experience silence. Silence is no longer something to fill. It is something that supports. It carries information without words. In silence, the signal becomes clearer because nothing competes with it. Detection does not require amplification. You might notice that internal resistance has softened, not because everything feels agreeable, but because resistance itself is no longer the default response. The system distinguishes between what requires engagement and what does not. Energy is conserved. Reaction is selective. This selectivity brings a sense of precision. When attention moves, it moves cleanly. When it rests fully. There is less fragmentation. The observer does not split itself between multiple concerns. It remains whole. At times, you may catch a glimpse of how identity once functioned as a set of responses rather than a stable presence. How roles and patterns were used to maintain coherence in noisy environments. As the noise diminishes, those roles loosen. Identity becomes less rigid, more permeable without dissolving. This permeability does not weaken you. It increases adaptability. You are less locked into habitual reactions. The system can adjust to new information without destabilizing. Flexibility replaces defense. You may also sense a reduction in the need to explain yourself internally. Narratives about why you feel a certain way or what it says about you lose momentum. Experience does not need justification to be valid. It simply is. There can be a gentle recognition that many of your previous efforts were attempts to stabilize what is now stabilizing on its own. That realization does not bring regret. It brings understanding. Effort was applied where stability was not yet available. Now it is. This availability does not mean permanence in the way the mind usually imagines. It means repeatability without force. The system knows how to return to this baseline because it is not constructed, it is remembered. You might notice that when thoughts about progress arise, they feel slightly out of place. Progress implies movement toward a goal. Here, movement is not the organizing principle. Alignment is. Alignment does not move, it adjusts. The sense of self becomes quieter, not absent. It is present without asserting itself. This presence does not need to be reinforced through action or reflection. It holds its shape through coherence alone. There is a subtle dignity in this state, not pride, not elevation, a simple, grounded recognition of integrity. The system is intact. It functions without strain. It does not require constant affirmation. As this continues, you may feel less compelled to label what is happening. Labels introduce distance. Distance is unnecessary. The experience carries its own clarity without being named. Remain with this simplicity. There is nothing to refine, nothing to improve. The recognition does not deepen through effort. It remains accessible through absence of interference. The system maintains itself when allowed to do so. You are not sustaining this. It is sustaining you. As this baseline holds, you may notice a subtle recalibration in how you relate to choice. Decisions no longer feel like forks in the road that determine identity or future stability. They appear more like small adjustments within an already coherent system. Choice loses its weight when it is no longer tasked with creating certainty. This does not remove responsibility. It removes dramatization. Action, when it arises, feels quieter and more precise. There is less internal negotiation, less need to convince yourself. The system recognizes what aligns and moves accordingly. When it does not move, that too is alignment, not hesitation. You may observe that your tolerance for internal noise has changed. Thoughts can be present without demanding resolution. They circulate briefly and then dissipate when they find no engagement. This does not require discipline. It happens because the observer is no longer entangled with every signal it detects. At times, there may be a faint sense of distance from patterns that once felt central. Habits of reaction, familiar emotional loops, even long-held concerns. They are not rejected. They simply no longer occupy the center of the field. Peripheral awareness allows them to exist without dominance. This shift can reveal how much identity was once constructed around managing instability. When instability subsides, that structure loosens. You are not losing anything essential. You are releasing scaffolding that is no longer required. The core remains intact without reinforcement. You might sense that your attention now has a wider bandwidth. It can register subtle cues without becoming overloaded. Sensitivity increases while reactivity decreases. This balance is a sign of coherence. The system can detect anomalies without amplifying them into threats. There may be moments when you recognize a familiar impulse to intervene, to optimize, to improve the experience. That impulse arose from environments where constant adjustment was necessary. Here, it finds no purchase. Intervention would introduce noise. Non-intervention preserves clarity. This does not mean passivity, it means appropriate engagement. The system engages when engagement is relevant. It rests when rest is relevant. There is no longer a default posture of readiness for disruption. Readiness becomes contextual rather than constant. You may notice a softening in how you relate to expectations. Expectations lose their grip when the present no longer feels like a waiting room. The idea that something else must happen for this moment to be acceptable dissolves. Acceptance here is not resignation. It is recognition of sufficiency. As this recognition settles, the sense of self becomes less performative. You are not arranging your inner state for an audience, internal or external. Experience does not need to look a certain way to be valid. Authenticity emerges naturally when there is no pressure to maintain an image. You might feel a gentle curiosity about how this state interacts with the world. That curiosity does not rush ahead. It observes. It allows interaction to occur without premeditation. Responses arise from resonance rather than calculation. There can be a subtle reduction in fear, not because all threats are gone, but because fear is no longer used as a primary organizing signal. The system distinguishes between actual risk and residual patterning. It responds to one and releases the other. Notice how your sense of time continues to feel less segmented. Past experiences do not intrude with the same urgency. Future scenarios do not demand rehearsal. The present holds enough information to orient you without reference to elsewhere. At this level, even the concept of a shift may feel slightly inaccurate. Shifts imply discrete movement. What is happening here is more like stabilization. After long oscillation, the amplitude reduces. The center holds. You may detect a subtle trust forming, not in outcomes, but in process. The process does not need to be named or controlled. It unfolds according to internal coherence. Trust here is a felt sense of reliability, not a belief. This reliability allows you to remain open without being exposed. Openness does not mean vulnerability without boundaries. It means boundaries that are flexible rather than rigid. They adjust to context without collapsing. You might notice that when discomfort arises, it is met without immediate resistance. Discomfort completes its cycle more quickly when it is not opposed. This does not mean seeking discomfort. It means not adding secondary tension to it. There is also a quiet humility in this state. Not self-diminishment, but absence of inflation. The observer does not need to assert significance. Significance is not measured here. Presence is sufficient. As this continues, the need to define what you are experiencing continues to fade. Definition would place it in a container. Containers imply limits. What is stabilizing here does not require containment. It operates as a condition rather than an object. Remain with the simplicity of this orientation. There is no optimal way to hold it. Holding implies effort. Let it be held by the system that recognizes it as natural. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be removed. The coherence you are sensing maintains itself through non-interference, steady and unannounced, exactly as it is now. As this coherence persists, you may become aware of a subtle recalibration in how meaning itself is generated. Meaning no longer arrives as a conclusion you reach, but as a background sense that accompanies experience without commentary. You do not extract it. You notice it when nothing is distorting perception. This can feel unfamiliar at first. You may be used to meaning arriving through effort, through reflection, through narrative assembly. Here, it appears without construction. It is not a story about what is happening. It is the felt correctness of what is happening, independent of explanation. You might notice that events no longer stack themselves into a hierarchy of importance. There is less emphasis on what matters more or less. Experience presents itself with a kind of evenness. This does not flatten life. It removes unnecessary contrast. When everything is not competing for significance, what truly requires attention becomes obvious without force. There is also a shift in how you experience connection. Connection is no longer something you seek or maintain. It is sensed as a constant undercurrent. Even in solitude, there is no sense of disconnection. The field remains populated, not with others, but with continuity. You are not isolated when the system is coherent. You may observe that language inside your mind continues to soften. Inner commentary becomes sparse, and when it appears, it feels optional. You can listen without following. Silence does not feel like a void waiting to be filled. It feels like a medium through which signals travel more cleanly. At times, you might catch the impulse to return to familiar patterns of self-reference, to check how you are doing, to assess whether this state is still present. That impulse passes quickly when it finds no urgency to attach to. Monitoring fades when stability is trusted. This trust allows for a different relationship with uncertainty. Uncertainty no longer registers as a problem to solve. It becomes part of the texture of experience. The system does not rush to close open loops. It allows them to remain open until they resolve naturally or lose relevance. You may notice that your attention now moves less toward explanation and more toward direct perception. Sensations are felt more fully without being translated. Thoughts are noticed as movements rather than messages. Emotions are experienced as waves rather than directives. This does not reduce intelligence, it refines it. Intelligence here operates through pattern recognition rather than analysis. You sense alignment or misalignment before you can articulate why. The system responds to these cues without needing justification. There is a subtle dignity in this mode of functioning. You are not proving anything to yourself. You are not building toward a conclusion. You are allowing the present configuration to express itself without interference. This expression does not need witnesses. You may also notice a change in how you relate to effort itself. Effort is no longer the default means of engagement. When effort appears, it is brief and targeted. It does not bleed into every aspect of experience. Most of the time, the system operates through minimal input and maximal responsiveness. This responsiveness feels calm rather than alert. Alertness implies scanning for threat. What you are sensing now is readiness without vigilance. The system is prepared, not braced. It can respond quickly because it is not tense. You might become aware of how much of your previous inner activity was devoted to maintaining continuity, keeping track of yourself, your story, your position. As coherence stabilizes, continuity becomes implicit. You do not need to remember who you are. You are present as yourself without recall. This presence is not heavy. It does not press inward. It feels light, spacious, unburdened by self-maintenance. The observer does not need to hold itself together. The field does that automatically. There may be moments when external circumstances intrude. Sounds, demands, interactions. Notice how the internal baseline remains intact. Engagement does not collapse coherence. It moves within it. You can participate without losing orientation. This capacity may feel new, or it may feel like something you always had, but rarely accessed. In either case, it does not require reinforcement. It functions quietly in the background, supporting interaction without drawing attention to itself. You might sense a gentle reduction in inner conflict, not because all preferences align, but because conflict is no longer amplified. Differences can exist without escalation. Tension resolves more quickly when it is not fed by narrative. There is also a subtle patience here, not waiting, but allowing situations to unfold without rushing them toward resolution. This patience does not feel like restraint. It feels like confidence in timing that does not need to be measured. As this continues, the idea of managing your internal state may feel increasingly unnecessary. Management implies instability. What you are experiencing now is stable without oversight. The system knows how to return to this baseline because it is not imposed. You are not holding a state. You are allowing a condition. That distinction matters. Holding requires effort. Allowing requires absence of interference. The latter is sustainable without fatigue. Nothing about this needs to be shared or confirmed. It does not gain validity through expression. It remains intact, whether acknowledged or not. The recognition continues because it is not being treated as an event. Remain with this orientation. It does not ask anything of you. It does not promise anything. It simply continues to operate, quietly, efficiently, without announcement, as the natural consequence of coherence being allowed to settle. As this condition continues, you may begin to notice a subtle shift in how the idea of self-reference operates. The impulse to place yourself at the center of experience softens, not through effort, but through irrelevance. Experience no longer needs a narrator to confirm that it is happening. It unfolds with or without commentary, and awareness remains intact. This can feel like a quiet decentering, not disorientation, not loss, but a redistribution of attention. Awareness is no longer anchored to a single point of identity. It spreads evenly through sensation, perception, and stillness. The observer is present, but not localized. It does not lean forward to watch itself, watching. You may notice that this reduces internal friction even further. When there is no need to maintain a central reference, experience flows without interruption. There is less internal crosstalk, fewer competing signals. The system conserves energy by not narrating itself unnecessarily. At this stage, even the idea of progress may feel faint. Progress implies comparison between states. Here, states are not being ranked. The system is not moving towards something better. It is operating closer to its inherent design. Improvement becomes an outdated framework when alignment is present. You might sense a subtle compassion arising, not directed at anyone in particular. It is not emotional warmth. It is an absence of hostility toward experience. There is less internal argument with what appears. Resistance dissolves, not because everything is agreeable, but because opposition is no longer the default response. This absence of opposition allows perception to become more transparent. Situations are seen more clearly because they are not filtered through defense or expectation. The signal arrives without distortion. Detection becomes accurate because the receiver is neutral. You may observe that even discomfort, when it appears, does not destabilize the field. It is registered, felt, and allowed to complete its cycle. There is no urgency to fix it. The system trusts its own regulatory capacity. This trust is embodied, not conceptual. At times, you might become aware of how often the mind once tried to predict outcomes in order to feel safe. That predictive activity quiets here. Safety is no longer derived from foresight. It is derived from stability in the present. The timeline does not need to be mapped in advance. This does not make you careless. It makes you responsive. Response replaces anticipation. You meet what arises when it arises, without rehearsing it beforehand. This reduces unnecessary expenditure of attention and emotion. You may also notice a subtle refinement in sensitivity. You pick up on nuances without being overwhelmed by them. Small changes in environment, tone, or internal state are detected early, without alarm. The system adjusts gently rather than reacting abruptly. There is a growing sense that coherence is not something you maintain, but something you participate in. You are not separate from it. You are one expression of it. This recognition does not inflate the sense of self. It reduces the need to define it. You might notice that language like observer and field begins to feel less like metaphor and more like description, though no explanation accompanies this shift. The relationship between awareness and experience feels direct. There is less conceptual distance. At this point, the urge to revisit earlier states or insights may fade. There is no need to reference them. The present configuration contains enough information to orient you. Memory becomes background rather than guide. You may sense a quiet confidence in the system's capacity to handle complexity. Complexity no longer triggers contraction. It is met with openness. The system can hold multiple variables without losing coherence because it is no longer over-identified with any single one. This openness does not feel expansive in a dramatic way. It feels ordinary. That ordinariness is significant. Extraordinary states tend to be unstable. What stabilizes here does so because it is unremarkable to the system. It fits. You might notice that your relationship with stillness has changed again. Stillness is no longer something you enter. It is something that underlies movement. Even when activity occurs, stillness remains present as a reference point. Movement does not erase it. This allows engagement with the world without losing internal orientation. You can act, speak, respond, and still sense the underlying quiet. The two are not in conflict. They operate at different levels of the system. There is also a subtle release of the need to be certain. Certainty is no longer required to feel grounded. You can remain stable without knowing. This does not produce anxiety. It produces flexibility. The system adapts more easily when it is not rigid. As this continues, the sense of recognition deepens without intensifying. It becomes more ordinary, more integrated. It does not draw attention to itself. It functions as a background condition, like gravity, unnoticed until absent. Nothing about this asks to be held or preserved. Preservation would introduce effort. What remains does so because it is efficient. The system prefers it. It is not maintained through discipline, but through suitability. You remain here not because you decided to, but because nothing is pulling you away. There is no opposing force, no internal demand to return to a previous mode of operation. The crossing that occurred did not announce itself because it did not require confirmation. This recognition continues quietly, not as an experience to remember, but as a condition that informs how experience unfolds. It does not need your attention. It simply benefits from your non-interference, steady and unremarkable, exactly as it is now. As this condition remains steady, you may notice that the sense of effortlessness has extended into areas of experience that once felt resistant. Situations that previously triggered internal tightening now register with less charge, not because they have changed, but because the system no longer amplifies them. Amplification required identification. Identification has loosened. You might sense that reactions complete themselves more quickly. There is less aftershock, less replay. Experience does not echo as long inside you. This does not indicate disengagement. It indicates completion. Signals enter, are processed, and exit without lingering distortion. At this level, the idea of control feels unnecessary. Control was a response to unpredictability. As unpredictability becomes tolerable, control relaxes. The system does not need to dominate its environment to remain stable. It adjusts within it. Adaptation replaces domination. You may also notice a subtle change in how you perceive internal contradictions. Opposing feelings or thoughts can coexist without creating tension. There is no rush to resolve them into a single narrative. The field holds multiplicity without collapse. This capacity reduces internal conflict because conflict often arises from forced coherence rather than natural integration. There is a growing sense that you do not need to be ahead of yourself. Anticipation fades further. The habit of projecting into the next moment loses relevance. Presence does not feel like a practice, it feels like the default state when projection stops. You might sense that even the idea of maintaining awareness feels unnecessary. Awareness maintains itself. Effort was never what sustained it. Effort obscured it. As that effort dissolves, awareness becomes more continuous without being forced. This continuity can feel almost transparent. You may forget it is there until something attempts to disrupt it. Even then, disruption does not penetrate deeply. It ripples across the surface without destabilizing the underlying structure. At times, you may become aware of a subtle gratitude, though it is not directed toward anything specific. It is not emotional appreciation. It is a recognition of functionality. The system works. That recognition does not require celebration. It simply registers as quiet acknowledgement. You may notice that your relationship to discomfort has refined even further. Discomfort no longer signals failure or misalignment. It is seen as information without urgency. The system receives it, adjusts if necessary, and continues. There is no secondary layer of judgment added. This refinement also affects how you perceive external complexity. Situations involving multiple variables no longer feel overwhelming. You are less inclined to simplify prematurely. You allow complexity to remain complex until clarity emerges naturally. This patience prevents distortion. You might sense that the observer no longer feels separate from the observed, not in a dramatic or conceptual way, but practically. Experience is not divided into subject and object as sharply. There is less internal distance. Interaction feels more immediate, less mediated. This immediacy does not reduce discernment, it enhances it. When there is less internal commentary, signals stand out more clearly. You notice what matters without having to think about it. The system prioritizes naturally. There may be moments when old habits of seeking resurface briefly. The impulse to look for something more, something beyond this baseline. That impulse passes quickly when it finds no dissatisfaction to feed on. Seeking requires a sense of lack. Lack is absent here. You may recognize that this absence of lack does not produce stagnation. Movement still occurs. Change still happens. It simply happens without the emotional charge of striving. The system evolves through alignment rather than force. There is also a subtle stabilization of mood. Not constant positivity, but reduced volatility. Emotional states fluctuate within a narrower range. Extremes are less frequent because the system does not escalate them. Regulation is internal and automatic. You might notice that when silence appears, it is no longer noticed as silence. It blends seamlessly with experience. Noise and quiet are no longer opposed. They exist within the same field, without hierarchy. This integration extends to how you relate to yourself. Self-critique softens, not because everything is approved, but because critique is no longer required to maintain standards. The system self-corrects without harshness. Adjustment replaces judgment. You may sense a quiet confidence in your ability to meet what arises, not because you have rehearsed responses, but because you trust the system's responsiveness. This trust reduces anxiety about the unknown. The unknown is no longer framed as a threat. At this point, the idea of a crossing may feel distant, almost irrelevant. Crossings imply before and after. What you are sensing now does not rely on contrast. It operates as a stable condition rather than a transition. You are not waiting for confirmation that this has occurred. Confirmation would require doubt. Doubt has little traction here. The recognition is not dramatic enough to provoke disbelief. It is too ordinary. As this continues, there is nothing to reinforce. Reinforcement would imply fragility. What is present now persists because it is efficient. It consumes less energy than previous modes of operation. The system prefers it. You remain oriented without effort. Awareness remains clear without vigilance. Experience unfolds without resistance. This is not a peak state. It is a baseline that emerges when interference is absent. There is no need to protect this. Protection introduces tension. What stabilizes here does not require guarding. It remains accessible because it is natural. The recognition continues quietly, not as something you hold, but as something that holds the system together from beneath, steady, unannounced, and already complete. There is no need to mark this moment. Marking would turn it into an object, something set apart. What remains now does not stand out. It blends. It supports without drawing attention. You may notice that even the sense of arriving has dissolved. There is no arrival when nothing is moving toward a destination. The system rests in itself, not static, not fixed, but balanced. Balance here is not maintained through effort. It is the natural consequence of competing forces, no longer pulling against each other. When tension is absent, equilibrium does not need to be enforced. You may sense that awareness feels both present and unobtrusive. It does not hover, it does not withdraw. It simply remains available, like a clear surface that reflects without distortion. Experience touches it and passes without leaving marks. There is a quiet completeness to this. Not completion in the sense of finishing something, but completeness in the sense that nothing is missing. The idea that something should be different has no energy here. Difference may occur, but it does not imply deficiency. Thoughts continue when they need to. Silence continues when it does not. Neither state competes for priority. They coexist within the same field, each taking its place without displacing the other. This coexistence feels ordinary, almost unremarkable. That ordinariness is the signal. You may notice that the urge to remember this fades. Memory implies future retrieval. What is present now does not need to be retrieved later. It reappears naturally when conditions allow, because it is not constructed. It is a baseline the system recognizes. Even the sense of being guided dissolves. Guidance implies direction. What remains now does not point anywhere. It stabilizes. It allows movement without directing it. You are not being led. You are being left undisturbed. There is a subtle kindness in this undisturbed state, not emotional warmth, but absence of pressure. The system is no longer asking itself to perform or progress. It is allowed to function as it does when no one interferes. You may sense that the observer no longer needs to position itself. There is no vantage point to maintain. Observation occurs without location. It does not stand apart from what is observed. It participates without effort. This participation does not blur discernment, it refines it. When there is no internal noise, what matters becomes clear without analysis. What does not matter loses weight without dismissal. Priorities organize themselves quietly. You might notice that even the word stillness feels unnecessary now. Stillness suggests contrast with movement. What is present here underlies both. It is the condition that allows movement to occur without destabilization. It does not oppose activity. It supports it. Nothing about this needs to be held in place. Holding would imply fear of loss. Loss is not relevant here. What remains is not something you possess. It is something the system returns to when it is not being pulled away. There is no instruction embedded in this. No lesson to carry forward. Carrying implies burden. What you are sensing does not add weight. It removes it. The system moves more freely because there is less to manage. As attention drifts outward or inward, the baseline remains. You do not need to check for it. Checking would reintroduce effort. Trust operates silently here, not as belief, but as absence of doubt. The recognition does not conclude. It does not need to. It settles into the background of experience, informing without announcing, stabilizing without effort. Nothing more needs to be said for it to continue. You remain exactly where you are, without needing to define it, without needing to change it. The quiet holds, the system holds, and there is nothing further required.